Okay. Hello and good evening, and welcome to episode, I think I'm counting it correctly, 46 of Shelf Analysis. I had a conversation with a friend of mine today who was on episode 16. And we discussed how very, 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 very long ago that was and what a completely different universe we all lived in. Welcome along tonight. Thanks again for joining me again for another episode of this. I've got a fantastic guest to talk to you tonight, whose work I really love, and there's been a nice little buzz about him being on here during the week as well. If you have questions, you can, of course, put them in comments. Either if you're watching on YouTube, you can put them there. If you're watching live in the Ricochet Book Club, of course, you can include them in comments there. If you're watching later on RTE Culture, nothing I can do for you. This all happened a very long time ago. Now, a couple of things I want to flag with you before we go anywhere, before we talk to tonight's guest. I have mentioned this once already, but I think it's worth a mention again. This coming Thursday is the ceremony for the International Dublin Literary Award for 2020. The shortlist is there. You'll see it in front of you. It's an extraordinary set of books. And the ceremony from the Gravity Bar in the Guinness Storehouse in Dublin, you're able to watch it from 11 a.m. this coming Thursday. Normally, it will be done in a completely different fashion. It will be done in a large room full of lots of bookish people, all of whom were very excited, and in front of many of the authors involved as well, and some of the translators. That won't be happening this year, sadly. It's me and a bunch of other people, mostly people who are filming it, in a room in Dublin. However, I'm thrilled again to be presenting the International Dublin Literary Award 2020. That is this coming Thursday morning at 11 a.m. You get to watch it. Just have a look at the International Literary Festival Dublin website. ILF Dublin is the co-host this year. Have a look at their website. You can register for tickets. And of course, the ticket is free. It is not going to cost you anything. Now, also worth a mention are a couple of other things that I want to flag with you and get out of the way. Primarily this one, really, to be honest with you. The book show is back. We were back last... Ooh, do that again. That worked out quite nicely, actually. Let's press that button again. I've only been doing this for 46 episodes. The book show was back last Sunday on RTE Radio 1 at 7 o'clock. We are on every Sunday on Radio 1 at 7 o'clock between now and Christmas. If you want to have a listen to last week's podcast, you can, of course, wherever you get yours. Just put in RTE Book Show. Last week, we were talking to Donal Ryan and Elaine Feeney, amongst others. As you can see in front of me, although his name is obscured, it is Frank Cottrell Boyce, the children's author that we're talking to, and famous screenwriter as well, amongst other things, that we're talking to this coming Sunday on the book show. We're going to be talking to Sarah Bellm as well, who is going to be interrogated by a book club in County Monaghan. That and a bunch of other things all happening as part of this weekend's book show. And that's this coming Sunday at 7 on Radio 1. The podcast available from Friday as per usual. I don't have a lot else to mention to you, really, other than, and I will mention it at the very end very briefly, thank you to our friends at the Irish Independent Review section on a Saturday, because what they've been doing every Saturday over the course of the last few weeks, and they will be doing this week as well, is a section on the latest book by the author that we talk to on Shelf Analysis every Wednesday. So if you're the latest book by tonight's guest this coming Saturday. Again, they'll be doing exactly the same thing. It's the review section of the Saturday Irish Independent, if you grab your copy. Tonight's guest on Shelf Analysis is a man whose work you may know well, whether it's through Capital, whether it is through his exceptional The Wall a couple of years ago, which I read, adored, and just kept pushing on every single person I could. I was thrilled to find out that he was doing a brand new collection of short stories, and that those short stories all had a slightly horrific, slightly futuristic, slightly techno tinge to them. It's far easier for him to explain these things than it is for me to do it. So hopefully I'm going to press this button here, I'm going to press this button here, and I'm going to say hello and good evening and welcome to Shelf Analysis. 3, 2, 1, it does a countdown thing, to John Lanchester. Good evening, sir.
Evening, Rick. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. Thanks so many for coming on. Tell us, before we start to talk about books or the things you're going to recommend or anything like that, a little bit about how the last few months have been for you. It's always something we ask of authors here. Personally, professionally, it's been an extraordinary year for everyone. But what's it been like for you?
Well, it's been strange. I mean, it's been strange partly because professionally it's kind of the same. You know, writing is as, you know, solitary and private and homebound an occupation as there is. And so in a way I'm kind of a canary in the coal mine for the the extent of the psychic effects of it. Because in theory, my working life's the same. I'm sitting at the same desk I would be sitting at normally. And, most of the process of making a book is you on your own at a keyboard, and then you send off, you send it to people, get responses, incorporate the responses, then you get an edit, then you get proof. And all of that is no different. So the fact that it's actually wrenchingly odd and invasive and impossible to get out of my head, is actually a sign, I think, of just how much bandwidth it occupies. And I find actually, I had COVID. I had it back at the start. My wife got it from her book group. 5 people sitting around a table drinking a litre of Pinot Grigio and shouting for 4 hours. I mean, who'd have thought?
Who knew?
And so my wife got it, and then and she was ill. Fortunately, in what they call the mild to moderate range, and then I had it about a week later. Again, mild to moderate. So it's, it was, we were both lucky in that sense. And then I had a period of brain fog for about 6 weeks afterwards. I found it quite hard to concentrate, and then could get back to work. And when I did get back to work, I found I could do about half. Just a working day was about half as productive. And I think that was a measure of just how much, as I say, bandwidth, how much, even if your life is the same as it was before, working life, it's still very hard to, it's hard to be fully present, really.
What was it like in terms of reading? Because in terms of authors I've spoken to on this series, there's whether you were able to work or not, or whether you were able to even read or not. Has that altered? Has that changed? Did it affect you in any way?
I had to think, when if I get ill, so like everyone else, I get flu every 10 years or so, and I was reading the same books I read when I was getting over a thing. So I was reading sort of childhood and young adult favourites. So the Earthsea books by Ursula Le Guin, and then a bunch of old SF classics. So the Dune books, Isaac Asimov, things like wonderful books, but things that I kind of reconnect with when I'm looking for comfort and familiarity. I think that's quite a wide. You talk to more people than I have. I think that's quite a widespread thing. People want to kind of revisit stuff when you're in that period of feeling anxious and insecure.
I think immensely so. What I love is the idea that Dune is one of your comforts. Now, convince me. I attempted Frank Herbert's Dune. I think I was I'm thinking about maybe 13, 14, 15, and I had a couple of cracks at it. It felt a little bit like Ulysses did as an adult. And I failed miserably. I made it probably no more than about 80 or 90 pages into. Now, I saw the trailer for the upcoming Denis Villeneuve's film, which I looked at and thought, oh, this looks very exciting. I probably should have another go at Dune. And my original copy of it is long since gone. Convince me why I should have another crack at Frank Herbert's Dune.
It's an impossible pitch, Rick. It's one of those things that if people have that resistance, I've noticed it talking about fantasy, but fantasy and SF are the same. You can't. People either it either clicks or it doesn't, and there is just this. I don't know if it's a suspension of disbelief thing or something inherent to the genre, and it's just a very binary setting. People are on or off about it, and you can't change their minds. I mean, I'm super excited about the film. Did you see it's postponed?
I have, and that has made me obviously far less excited about it, because now it's at least another 12 months before we get to see it. But Denis Villeneuve's a really smart filmmaker. He's made some really, really good SF films. So I was dying to see it, to be honest with you. And
David Lynch is a great filmmaker too, and his version of Dune it's absolutely fantastic, because the bit explaining it and setting up at the beginning, the scroller. You're 10 seconds into the film and you already know it makes absolutely no sense at all.
As happens with many David Lynch films. You see, I am that person with that binary switch, though. I found myself reading very recently. I don't know if you've ever read Stephen Baxter. I read Stephen Baxter's World Engines, the first of his World Engines series recently, it's a big book. But once I found myself getting into it, it felt like it had that air of almost Arthur C. Clarke kind of comfort reading about it, that kind of solid science happening in space, and it got me a long way through. I still think I'm definitely going to find myself a nice copy of Dune and go through that. I'm going to move swiftly along then to your recent work. I do want to ask you maybe before, because I'm going to talk about the new collection, but about The Wall as well, because reading the Wall a couple of years ago now, it seemed incredibly prescient at the time and seems even more so today. Maybe just for people who haven't read it, just explain maybe briefly what the book was about.
Well, I started on it in 2016, and the premise was really of unfortunately, it's sort of a non-fiction premise. It's the trajectory we're on in respect of the climate, which is in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC report has, if we don't change anything, and there's a band of probabilities, but if we go along the sort of middle of that band, we get about just under 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And it was really what that world would look like, what a world, of catastrophic, irreversible climate change would look like. And it's set in a version of Britain which has the wall of the title is a giant wall all around the whole of Britain, which is there partly to keep out the risen sea levels that come from all the ice having melted, and partly to keep out the starving, desperate people fleeing other parts of the world, who in the book are just called the others. And in the world of the book, everyone in that society has to spend 2 years as a form of national service standing on the wall guarding it. And the book tells a story of someone who, it begins on his day one when he first arrives on the wall on his tour of duty.
Again, I'm just skimming it, but for those people who have not read it, I pressed physical copies into the hands of a lot of people I knew, and I can't recommend it highly enough, which is why I was thrilled to find out that then you were writing a new collection of short stories, some of which have similarly speculative fiction bent to them, although when you get into the collection, there's an awful lot more going on than just that. So the new book is called Reality and Other Stories. It has a fantastic cover, which would immediately have made me pick it up in a shop anyway. Maybe tell us a little bit about that then. This is the new book.
Well, I didn't sort of sit down and plan to write a book of short fiction. In fact, many times, when I've been asked to contribute short fiction to this or that, I would say I've never written a short story and don't think I can. And then the first one, it was actually, we were staying with friends over New Year, and I thought as a kind of present or a party piece, to write something as an entertainment to read to the assembled company, the very severely hungover assembled company on New Year's Day. So I wrote this story really as a sort of performance piece to be read aloud. And then someone there said, well, you should have a think about publishing it. And so I sent it off, and it was published. It's published in the New Yorker, which was a great, boon, because and I felt
that's not too bad.
No, it's not too bad. And I was really excited. I said, well, okay, I'll do that again. And then, but it's oddly like it's like being like most people. I wrote very bad poetry as a teenager. All of it, fortunately, lost to posterity. But my memory of being a very bad teenage poet was that it was quite passive, that you sort of had to wait for the ideas to come to you. You couldn't sit down and crack your knuckles and say, okay, I'm going to write a poem now. You had to sort of wait for it. And this was slightly like that. The ideas sort of came at irregular intervals. In a sense, they're more fun to write than novels because you don't go out on as much of a limb. It doesn't take as long. There isn't the same sense of being kind of trapped by the book. If a book takes a year or two to write, you get very sort of there is a claustrophobic thing about it. You have to finish it. Whereas short story that would take a couple of weeks to write, it doesn't have the same sense of the cost of getting it wrong and having to abandon it is lower. So it's less oppressive in a way to write. And so I'd written 2 or 3 of them, and then I suddenly realized that they had this theme that to do with the kind of shadow side of technology, or the kind of inner life of technology, or the kind of spooky and uncanny side of it. And then, as I said, I was almost halfway through the collection before I realized what it was about. I thought, oh well, okay, I'll keep on going till I finished. But one of the odd things about a book of short stories is, in a weird way, you don't know when you've finished, because I still have 1 or 2 ideas that I was thinking about doing, but they wouldn't quite come, and I'd wait for a bit. And in that sort of passive way I was talking about, I kept thinking I'd wake up in the morning and it would have solved itself, and that didn't happen. So in the end I thought, okay, what the hell, I'll declare victory and it's finished now. 8 stories is the book.
Because it is that way with collections of short stories. You're right. It could be 8, it could be 10, it could be 15, it could be, and it's kind of up to you to decide. Well, this feels like a collection. I said to you, we spoke yesterday, and I said to you that there were a couple of things that jumped out at me. I think the stories are fantastic. They're immensely entertaining, and it reminded me of 2 things. One of which was the short stories. Weirdly, the Victorian short stories of M.R. James. His strange, creepy fiction, particularly the story that involves the academic going to the conference in Eastern Europe, which is just I almost don't want to tell people what it's about, because I think it kind of ruins the story. And the second was Roald Dahl's stories for adults, particularly the collection. And I went and dug out my own collection here. It's the only book I'm going to demonstrate tonight, which is my copy of Roald Dahl's Kiss Kiss, which people might better know, because some of them were adapted for the Tales of the Unexpected TV series. I think it felt like both of those.
Well, I take both of those as compliments. The M.R. James was very much in my mind, especially for the story you mentioned, Coffin Liquor, because he has this particularly vivid thing about people who are kind of super brainy, super rational, rather buttoned up, as indeed he was as a person, being confronted with things they couldn't explain or understand. And the horror is partly the horror of ghouls and demons and the supernatural, but there's also a kind of horror, a sort of conceptual horror about the idea that you don't have the mental equipment to explain what's happening to you. That the inexplicable has a kind of terror to it, and I've always really liked that. And so that story is a kind of homage to M.R. James. But of him, by the way, I think his best story is a thing called Whistle and I'll Come to You. And there's an astonishingly good, I think it's available on YouTube. There's a BBC film, black and white film, directed by Jonathan Miller. I think it was the first thing he did for TV, with Michael Hordern as the academic central character. No spoilers, but anyone who has a spare half hour, who wants to not be able to sleep, certainly not tonight, and maybe not for the next week, and maybe not until 2021. I unreservedly recommend that. Whistle and I'll Come to You. No jump scares, so no horror, but just an incredibly powerful sense of eerie strangeness. And James is very good at that. And as for Roald Dahl, we were talking about this yesterday. I think he was such a good writer of these sort of joltingly strange, kind of wicked adult stories, but they're largely forgotten now. Sort of maybe it's a thing about the way that writers get so sort of chopped up into markets and segmented, and he's sort of filed as a children's writer now. And people have forgotten that he wrote an astonishingly good memoir as well, 2 memoirs, Boy and Going Solo, and they've forgotten these adult stories, which I love, because they have his sort of he clearly had I don't think he was a malign person, but he understood malignity. He understood badness. And in the children's stories, that gets around in the way that, the bad things happen to bad people, and in a way that children find very satisfying. But in the adult stories, there's a kind of, there's a sort of vengeful, gleeful, a kind of playful malignity. It's a really unusual tone. And it has this story, I haven't read it since I was at school, so this is in the sort of latter part of the 1970s, but I still vividly remember there's a brilliant story about a woman with a really horrible, controlling husband, and she bludgeons him to death with a frozen leg of lamb, and then serves it to the policeman who come to investigate it. And that's the pure Dahl sort of, the weird thing of pure evil and pure fun at the same time.
Yeah, I think if people get a chance to, if you can find, I'm sure it's still in print, but a very nice secondhand copy like that, if you can come across one. I realize we haven't actually really done what we're here for yet. So in theory, you're here to recommend some books that you love and that you think people should read. I have no sense of what you're going to suggest tonight, because there are no rules really. So where would you like to start?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll change the running order at the last minute, just because what we were talking about, what I read under lockdown. In lockdown, I was rereading the Earthsea books by Ursula Le Guin, which I absolutely love. And after I got over my post-COVID brain fog, I sort of read some other Le Guin, and this book, The Left Hand of Darkness, which I unforgivably have never read, which I think is actually her masterpiece. It is a piece of SF. It's about an envoy from a kind of evolved culture traveling to a culture that hasn't sort of joined their confederation of human worlds. And the people on the planet that she moves to, I'm just going to check the date actually to remind. Yeah, 1969. The people on the planet she moved to, he moves to, are gender fluid. They once a month they have a period when they're neither male nor female, and they actually I've misspoken. They're kind of neither male nor female most of the time, but then once a month they, as it were, settle to a particular gender, and they are in effect in heat during this one period. And the envoy is human like us, and doesn't, has great difficulty understanding and processing this strangeness about gender. And it's really fascinating at a time when ideas about gender and identity and sexuality and biological sex and all those things are being so debated and contested. But this book from 1969 is half a century old, and if it came out next week, it would seem ahead of its time and alert to all sorts of cultural currents. It's absolutely extraordinary, and it's done as it's a thriller. It's a political story. It's a story about otherness. It's a story about negotiating the differences between cultures, and it's a story about how hard it is to understand people, about the kind of necessary work of understanding people who are different from you. It's a proper flat out, money back guarantee masterpiece. I think she's an extraordinary writer, and she one of her parents was an academic anthropologist, and you can sort of see you can feel the anthropology in it, the kind of understanding of cultural kind of cultural interaction and the kind of negotiation between what you regard as normal and what other people regard as normal, and the kind of difficulty of that. It's an absolutely amazing book.
I think, to my own shame, I should attest the fact that I have a copy of that sitting downstairs for the last 5 years and still has yet to be read. You've now bumped it much, much, much further up into my to be read pile, because it is going to get read at some point. I think for maybe people who haven't read Becky Chambers' series of novels over the last few years, starting with A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, she deals with the whole idea of gender and gender fluidity in really interesting ways through science fiction as well. And she's got, I think, the fourth in that. I think it's this year or next year. Anyway, okay, book number 2. What have you got for me?
Well, the next thing I moved on to. It was when I was, as I said, I got over COVID and then was looking around for things to read, and I've gone back to reading Shakespeare, which is a terrible, terrible thing. He's the greatest writer in the English language. He's possibly the greatest writer in the history of the world. I certainly think I could argue that. And I hadn't read any Shakespeare for pleasure since the mid-1980s. When I was at university, which is a terrible thing. And for me, it was effectively, the pleasure of it was killed by studying it. I had to study it for exams, school and then uni. And I just sort of couldn't read it. It had all these associations. And so coming out of lockdown, I went back and started at the beginning, started with the Henry VI plays, which are the first things he wrote when he's in his early 20s. And the thing that's absolutely extraordinary is how relevant they are. Because they're about division, which is a big topic in Britain at the moment. They're about a society that's sort of fighting itself and is not at ease with itself and is sort of tearing itself apart. And they're also, fascinatingly, about having useless leaders. It's probably interesting because it's actually quite a difficult thing to dramatize. Just someone being a bit crap, And the thing about Henry VI is that he's a good man, which is another thing that's quite hard to dramatize, but he's just a useless king. And then moving on, you get Richard II, who's just sort of dithery and useless, and he's just rubbish at being a king. And it's a fascinating theme in the early Shakespeare's early history plays, of just leaders who are just a bit crap. They're not spectacularly evil. I mean, Richard III is, but they're just useless at their jobs. And that thing about sort of leaderly dysfunction and incompetence, is surprisingly resonant in the UK in 2020. And so, this sort of early Shakespeare is really what we're going through now.
The joys of Shakespeare is that at some point, wherever you are or whenever you are, there will be sections of his work that you will find will resonate with wherever you are. I have to admit, I find it really hard to read him cold on the page. I will go in a heartbeat to any production of any play. And again, I think because of the way it was taught to me when I was a kid as well, and taught straight off the page, I always found it hard going. And the first time I genuinely found myself enjoying Shakespeare was just going to productions in theatres, then going to the UK, seeing stuff in the Globe, seeing productions in London. And then all of a sudden it opens up an entire world. I still find it hard to read it off the page, despite the fact that I do, again, have a ceremonial complete works of Shakespeare sitting somewhere on a shelf here, somewhere behind me. Okay.
I'm the exact opposite, because I feel rather trapped in the theatre, and also with Shakespeare, I find the thing is that you want to be able to control the speed of processing, because sometimes there are lines that you just actually have to. There are scenes that you sort of are carried along by in the momentum, but there are other points where you just have to stop and to process it and work out what it means. And I get very frustrated in theatre. I feel it's almost like if you're a computer with your clock speed being slightly wrong.
Yeah.
My sort of clock speed is slightly out of sync with the way with the momentum of the play. And I do find it actually more pleasurable, that thing about because sometimes you just need to put it down and walk away from it.
And I find great pleasure in that being carried along by the wave of the performance and the production, and again, each to their own. Okay, that's fantastic for a second one. I think you're the first person in 46 episodes who's chosen Shakespeare as well, which is super.
I nearly took. There's a bit I hemmed and hawed in the epigraphs of this book, and there's a thing I wanted to use, and I found it something that was better from Hamlet. But it's one of those astonishing things that Shakespeare called. There's a warlock, a male witch, in one of the in the Henry VI one, and he talks about casting a spell. It's been deep night, dark night, the silent of the night, the time of night when Troy was set on fire. And it's just, that's a whole play. You can sort of see that, you can feel them kind of tiptoeing through the dark with kind of torches ready to set fire. It's absolutely astonishing.
Super. That's an amazing second choice. Where are you going to go to next? How do you follow that?
Queuing off that, I was on a bit of a history binge. So I dare say I'm not the first person to have chosen, but it's the new Hilary Mantel, which I absolutely loved. And it has a sort of, the thing that I really admire about it, as someone who's written both fiction and non-fiction, there's this dichotomy really between what you can do with fiction. You can get away with anything, but it has to feel true. So and believability is not the same as reality. So you can get away with anything as long as it has that sense of credibility. But life is full of things that are incredible. Incredible things happen absolutely all the time. And non-fiction lets you do things write about things that are unlikely, which life is full of. And the thing that she does extraordinarily well is she has the sort of arc of the historical truth. So we kind of know where the story's going, and we know the shape of it. And we know that Thomas Cromwell, the main character, is a tragic figure, even though he doesn't quite realize it himself. So it has that sort of fundamental believability, but it's crammed full of stuff. It's crammed full of detail and insight and poetry and this extraordinary dance she does between things that she's imagining and things that she's taken from the historical record, and it's so full of fact and truth and data and research, and at the same time it works it's so satisfying as an imaginative flight. And so there are things like, there's a little detail, there's one scene where Henry's talking about this sort of traitor Reginald Pole who lives abroad, and Cromwell sees this ring on his finger, and it's a ring with a kind of shard. It has a piece of crushed diamond on it, and I bet you anything it's actually a matter of historical record, because Mantell's a very kind of deep researcher. And he sees the ring, and then Henry, as he's talking about it, makes this gesture where he squeezes his hand inside his fist, which is clearly something she's made up. And I can't say how much I admire that thing, the mixture of the piece of the tiny glint of non-fiction fact with this wonderful thing of imaginative recreation of this sort of body language of this sort of thug, unthinkingly kind of flexing his fist. Absolutely astonishing. And the companion piece is this book of her non-fiction pieces from the London Review of Books, and they're absolutely wonderful. But I feel a deep personal connection to it, because I used to be an editor at the LRB when I was a young editor at the LRB, I was the person who suggested Mantell as a contributor way back in 1987. And the reason I knew about her was there was a V.S. Naipaul's brother, Shiva Naipaul, died very young, died in his 40s, tragically young. And there was a prize in his honour, Shiva Naipaul Memorial Prize. And I think it was for a piece of autobiographical or travel writing. And I entered it and didn't win, and was looking at, it was incredibly unjust and unfair and, clearly rigged, and, the winning entry was bound to be completely terrible. And then got that issue of The Spectator, published it. And it was a piece by this writer I'd never heard of called Hilary Mantel. And it was about living in Saudi Arabia. And it was 5,000 times better than the thing I'd written. And it also had this incredibly vivid payoff that I still remember about. I suppose in a way it goes back to the thing I was talking about Ursula Le Guin, about negotiating other cultures, trying to understand other cultures. And she talked about how horrible Saudi Arabia was. It's in the 80s. She'd lived there. And how horrible it was for women. And then just the last sentence had this extraordinary kicker about, sometimes to take other cultures seriously, it's not enough to understand them. Sometimes you have to hate it too. Mm. And it was just so, I've never forgotten it. And anyway, so talked about her to my colleagues, and so I feel very connected to this book, because that's a relationship with the LRB that's gone back a third of a century now, and she's done some astonishing work for the paper. I think it moves incredibly well between this thing of non-fiction and fiction.
I think for those people who maybe don't know as well, that is just brand new. It's literally hot off the shelves, and it's only out in the last couple of weeks. Is it out? Because sorry, my copy is here, so but it is out.
I think it was. I think it got shifted around, because there's a lot of stuff just coming out that should have come out.
Well, yeah,
earlier in the year.
Before you get to your next choice, sorry, a couple of comments that have come in already. Hazel Delaney says, the Left Hand of Darkness is sitting here in my husband's to be read pile. He's loving that it's coming with good recommendations. Thank you, Hazel. Emily Reynolds says, only getting to the trilogy now, started Wolf Hall the other evening. Very much loving it so far. My own wife has put in comments, you don't forget that 2010 adaptation of Whistle and I'll Come to You, the one with John Hurt, that was amazing. It was. There's also, maybe if people get to look at that as well, it's a great adaptation of it with John Hurt. 2010, a decade ago. Yeah. Okay. Well, tell me a little bit about your next choice then. Do you have another choice?
I do. And this, do you let people pick books they haven't read?
Yeah. This will be controversial at best. Please do.
Because I've been saving it up because I so loved her last book. It's the new Emily St. John Mandel, whose last, and the reason I'm reading it is because I absolutely loved her last book, which is called Station 11.
Yeah.
Which followed, picking up the Shakespeare thing I mentioned earlier. It's in a sort of post-apocalyptic landscape, and the central characters are a troupe of travelling actors who move around performing performing Shakespeare, and it begins with a pandemic. It's almost, some people might find it almost too on the nose to read now, but it's an absolutely wonderful book that has this sort of the thing I love about it is that you sort of don't see it coming. It's not like 7 other things. It's not like, oh no, not another post-apocalyptic Shakespeare traveling company post-pandemic novel, again. And the thing I really admire about her work, I admire writers who have that thing about you just sort of have that sense of freshness and surprise. So this one, I've like properly been saving it up for a treat, and it's much more realistic apparently than the last one. But the thing that I'm most looking forward to about it is that I know that I'm not going to see it coming, and I really admire that in writers, where you sort of you just sort of, it's like every book is a fresh surprise. I mean, nothing. By the way, there's nothing wrong with people who write the same book 20 times over as well. I really admire those writers like Anita Bruckner, variations on a small theme. But there's something very exciting about that sense of you just don't know where it's going.
And yeah, I'm entirely with you on, if people have never read Station 11, it is unlike anything. And I've read my fair share of post-apocalyptic scenarios, and you're right, traveling Shakespeare company post-pandemic is just very elegant and very beautiful.
And I remember, in fact, when someone explained it to me, I remember thinking I'd got the wrong end of the stick, that she sort of described 2 different books and slightly sort of, mashed and forgot that they were actually 2 different novels at the same time.
Yeah. That's okay. What else do you have more? We haven't even talked how many you have, so you keep going.
I've got a sort of 2-parter. I've been last thing at night, I've been going back and reading. I like reading poetry at night. Last thing, it's sort of soothing and calming. And there's this wonderful anthology, Penguin Book of English Verse from the 50s by John Hayward, who was a friend of T.S. Eliot's. They actually lived together for a while. Hayward was in a wheelchair, and Eliot used to look after him. And it's just an incredibly well-chosen anthology of classic English poetry. Skews quite a lot to the 16th and 17th centuries, which is a bit I absolutely love. And it's that thing again that I was talking about earlier, of things that I studied too much and then couldn't read. And it's been wonderful kind of going back and being able to read it, read it at my own speed and read it for pleasure. And the funny thing is that, as I think poetry in many ways is more important as our attention spans are getting shorter and there are more challenges to them. And I noticed that my willingness to engage with quite difficult text is actually lower than it used to be. And some of the books that I used to find kind of, they look back at, writers like Updike or Nabokov, or, classic mid-20th century things. It seems much denser than I remember. Mm-hmm. And clearly the books haven't changed, it's me that's changed. And our attention spans are getting kind of more fragmented, there are more demands on them, we're more used to doing 5 different things not very well at the same time. And I find it very helpful to read poetry as a way of sort of recentering my attention, and to pay attention to texts that can be quite short, but that sort of do make demands on you. If you're reading John Donne, you can't read Donne while you're checking your Twitter feed, and the news program is scrolling in the background with the thing across the bottom of the screen telling you about the end of the world, and someone showing you the latest meme on their Instagram feed. You just can't be done. You're either reading it or you're not. So it demands your full attention, and I find that really increasingly I feel sort of fed by that.
Can you remind us the title of that collection again, just for people who are
English Verse? I think it's already out of print, so that's not very helpful. But I'll tell you what, the companion thing is this wonderful anthology of Irish poetry, My News for You, by Geoffrey Squires. It's a body of work I don't really know at all well. I think your listeners will know a lot more about it than I do, and I think we'll particularly know more about this thing about it being, one of the world's great investigated, under-discussed resources of classic literature. And it's a book of, they're short poems for the most part. But at the risk of sounding like a bit nerdy, the thing that's astonishing about this book is it has unbelievably good and informative notes. So, I know absolutely nothing about the world it's describing, about classic Irish, about the history, the tensions of it. And so there's a poem, it's a 4-line poem. Whoops. Were the bright waves of the sea made of silver and the brown leaves gold, Finn would have given them all away. And then you turn to the notes, and it says, this poem is Keelcher's early response to Patrick's question as to whether Finn was a good man. And he says, blah, blah, blah. And it's about generosity. And it's about the idea of the Fianna having a non-Christian ethic. It's about a pagan ethic of complete generosity and open-handedness. So this guy, he would have given, if the sea was made of silver, he'd have given it away. And it has this, which is really fascinating, as a kind of non-Christian ethic about the Fianna. And I felt, apart from the wonderful nature of the poetry and all that, I felt properly educated and informed by it. Like, it's opened a window into a whole world of poetry that I didn't know.
I think it might to a lot of people here, and that's called My News for You. Is that right?
I now I just saw a chance reference to it somewhere, and so I saw it in a bookshop, and it was that thing where half an hour later you're still reading. Then it gets so embarrassing you have to buy the book.
Yeah.
As I say, I know it makes it sound dry to say that the extraordinary thing about it are the notes, but the notes are properly riveting for this sort of perspectives they open on this whole, as I say, this whole body of literature that we've just, speaking for my part, I knew nothing about.
Maybe for people who are interested, if you missed Doireann Ní Ghríofa on the show a couple of weeks ago, her new novel, her new piece of autofiction, talks very specifically about one classic Irish lyrical poem. And if you want to find out a bit more about that, you'll find that episode. It's just a couple of episode backs here. What else have you got, or is that it? That's it.
Yep.
That's not at all. That's
all you wrote.
That was a fantastic it to have. Dare I ask what you're writing now? Are you in the middle of something? Have you finished something?
Well, I've been having a go at, partly because I felt, the wall, I do feel strongly about the subject of climate change, and I'm having a go at doing an adapted version of it for the screen or for telly, just because, I know this will come as an astonishing newsflash, but, more people watch telly than read books. And it says I'm quite keen to get that mess. That novel does have a very deliberate point about, trying to imagine this, try to make people look at the path we're on as a way of averting it. It's an attempt to avert the future it describes. And so the more people I can get that message to, the better. So I'm having a go at doing that. But as we all know, that's a sort of long shot thing. And I've got a novel. I'm going to spend a bit longer working on that, and then I've got a novel I've been planning for a long time to get going on.
In terms of it being a long shot thing, though, one of those things I hear is that TV is desperate for ideas these days, because there's an awful lot of TV needs to be made, and then with people staying at home and watching more, and whether it's on streaming services or whether it's through the likes of the BBC. So it's a very visual novel. It's the sort of thing that would transfer fantastically to TV. Not that there are any TV executives watching this, but if they were,
and if they have a spare 10 million quid, I'll put my back's transfer details on at the end. I mean, one of the things that people in that world say about telly, they all use the same phrase, which is "the beast must be fed." It means that you actually have to make. If you want to make a film, basically you could confront an escalating series of people with grander and grander job titles who want to not make your film. Because if they make your film, they can get fired, they can lose their job, they can lose tens of millions of dollars. And so everyone has an incentive to not do it, which is why filmmaking is so frustrating. Whereas telly, the beast must be fed. They do actually make telly, especially in these islands. We've got remarkable, successful, thriving, global TV industries here. I think the things that sometimes people forget that, you know, in Europe, the film industry is actually the TV industry.
I look forward to that if and when it comes to pass. The current collection, let me stick up the cover one more time because it deserves it. It's a beautiful piece of cover art, as well as being a fantastic series of short stories that are out at the moment. It is called Reality and Other Stories. That's the gorgeous cover that there is on it for the moment. And John Lanchester, this has been lovely. It's been an absolute thrill to talk to you, and thanks a million for taking the time out tonight. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Rick. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, John. That was episode 46. Don't go anywhere because I need to tell you who is our guest next week as well on the show. Let me do this and this, because next week on Shelf Analysis, episode 47 is with Turkish academic, author, writer, and recently shortlisted, longlisted for the Booker. Elif Shafak is my guest on Shelf Analysis this time next week. If you've never seen her talk, I've had the pleasure of interviewing her at the Dalkey Book Festival a couple of times, and she's going to be absolutely fantastic. She's talking to me on the show next week. Have a look at the Irish Independent, the Saturday review section this coming Saturday in the Indo, because you'll find out more details about her and about what she's writing at the moment. That's it for me. I'll catch you on RTE Gold weekday mornings from 10 a.m. back on the Book Show on RTE Radio 1. This coming Saturday from 7 with Frank Cotterill Boyce and with Sarah Baum as well. And another Shelf Analysis here, same time next week. It's been lovely. Thanks so much for getting in contact. Cheers.